Okay, now's the time a hush should descend on the room, and we're ready to go. I'm Paul Revel. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this latest Askwith Forum. As you know, Askwith Forums are a series of public lectures that we do here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, where we bring outstanding leaders to our community to share their knowledge, to share new knowledge, to generate a conversation with us, and to offer their insights on some of the highest priority challenges that face us in the work that we do in public education in the United States today. They're a prominent part of our outreach work that we do as a community, and we're delighted to have all of you with us here today to talk about a big, expansive, and very important topic entitled Transformative Change in American Schools. A lot of us in various ways have been working for a long time on various elements of transformative change. And we're blessed tonight to have one of the nation's most experienced leaders in terms of doing this kind of work in Michele Cahill. And as you'll soon see in the quick bio that I'm going to read you that gives you just some highlights of her background, she's been able to be involved in the work of transformative change at many different levels, and has had to be a practitioner as well as somebody who thinks about policy, as well as somebody who thinks about the role of philanthropy, and just brings a rich body of experience to thinking about some of the prominent transformative change issues of our time, like the Common Core and other topics that she will be talking about, as we all work ever harder and try to think deeper on this challenge of delivering on the promise of education reform in the United States, of equity and excellence for all of our students, and all means all. Michele Cahill is the Vice President for National Program and Director of Urban Education at the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Prior to joining Carnegie, she held the position of Senior Counselor to the Chancellor for Education Policy in the New York City Department of Education under Chancellor Joel Klein. She was a member of the Children First senior leadership team that oversaw and implemented the full-scale reorganization and reform of the New York City public schools. She spent 3 years with Carnegie Corporation prior to that as senior program officer in the education division. She was responsible there for the vision and establishment of Schools for a New Society, the corporation's 7-city urban school reform experiment, and the New Century High Schools, a partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Open Society Institute, and New Visions for Public Schools. She served as vice president of the Fund for the City of New York, where she developed the Beacon School Initiative with New York City, and as a vice president for the Schools and Community Services at the Academy for Education Development, where she led several national demonstration projects with more than 20 urban school districts. Cahill spent a decade as the co-founder of the Public Policy Program, a nationally recognized innovative college program for non-traditional students, and assistant professor and director of the Urban Studies Program at St. Peter's College in Jersey City. She has a BA in Urban Affairs from St. Peter's College, a Master of Arts in Urban Affairs from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she pursued doctoral studies in social policy and planning at Columbia University, where she was a Revson Fellow. Please join me in welcoming Michele Cahill.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks to all of you for coming here tonight. I'll speak quickly so you can get to the Red Sox game, even though I am from New York. And I'm actually very, very honored to be here with you tonight and to be I hope having a dialogue with you about this critically important topic of how does transformative change in American schools take place? And a second question, how do we accelerate the learning of our students, especially those in middle and high schools? These are the big questions that have consumed me and many, many others for many decades. 40 years ago, in working with teenagers, when I was young, those kids who had dropped out of school, and I was working in a community center, I struggled with how to teach them to write well enough to produce a youth newspaper, to advocate for change in their community, and to form sufficient academic identities that they could re-engage with school after the negative experiences that they'd had. Central to this effort was high expectations, a belief that they could be contributors to their communities, and that tapping into their strengths could unlock their willingness to risk and put out the enormous effort that they would need to do to recuperate their learning and to accelerate how they were going to be learning. Does this sound familiar? This is what we need to be doing today in an even more challenging environment with young people who need to meet the ever more rising standards that are not artificially put there just to be barriers to them, but which relate to their possibilities for social mobility. Very soon afterwards, as Paul said, with colleagues, we had the opportunity and the challenge of designing a new college program that would bring very academically underprepared community leaders, many of whom were educated in the segregated South or in schools in Puerto Rico, but who had demonstrated tremendous commitment, energy, and skills as community leaders, but they didn't have the academic background to be able to read data, to solve problems in a technical way, to get into the ever-increasing jobs that were developing at that time in urban studies and public policy. To shorten the story, over several years, we used time, schedule, how do you use the schedule, money, faculty and coaching roles, curriculum and teaching supports, and entirely new ways of instructors working together to accelerate the learning of these several hundred students so that they could then go on after a transition year to meet the core curriculum requirements of a academically demanding Jesuit school. Over that decade and the next, hundreds of others were working on developing similar kinds of schools and programs, many, many more influential than the ones that I was involved with. Ted Sizer, Debbie Meyer, the Coalition of Essential Schools, James Comer and the School Development Program, which essentially was redesigning schools to support community and socio-emotional learning. All of these were attempts at redesigning schools to accelerate the learning, to recuperate the learning and accelerate the learning of students who were not being well served by schools. They were, for the most part, islands of innovation. The challenge that we'd had, and which I think we've made progress on, and we have some examples that I'm going to talk about this evening, was to design for scale, figure out how we could, from the beginning, think about how this. We actually did know, we not only knew in our gut, we now had evidence that you could accelerate the learning of underprepared students. It is critically important that we do more early childhood education. We should have universal early childhood. We need to do many, many things to prepare our youngest children all the way through elementary school. But we have a moral obligation, and our country needs us to value our adolescents and to build on what we know so that they can also have that promise of opportunity. So this evening I want to make two strategic points in addressing the question of how does transformational change take place in American schools? What do we need to do? And how do we accelerate the relationship, and its relationship to how do we accelerate the learning of students, especially those in middle and high school. So first, I believe we need to broaden understanding that transformational change is necessary and urgent. We need to build optimism that transformational change is possible. It's daunting, but engaging in transformational change is fundamental to preserving our democracy, enabling social mobility in a period of rapid societal change. Why do I say it's necessary and urgent? We need to have a productive dialogue about the purposes of public education and why the racial, social, and income inequalities that have limited the power of education have even greater negative impact when education is the primary currency of mobility. Our society has changed, our labor markets have changed. We no longer have the first advantage of being the first country in the world to have universal secondary education. It's not that we've gotten worse, it's the rest of the world has caught up. Technology has changed labor, has changed jobs so much that all young people need to have knowledge, they need to be able to learn content knowledge, they need to be able to learn complex skills, complex thinking skills, complex communication skills, and quantitative literacy, and they need to be able to take the content knowledge that they're learning, as you all can, and apply it in new situations, new and unfamiliar situations, which continue to change over time. So, good jobs increasingly require this deeper learning. But also democracy requires it. The complex challenges and problems we see in the political polarization today. We've worked on next generation science standards, the notion of how you make decisions as a voter, how you make decisions as a citizen in society on issues like climate change. We need, for our society, we need everyone to be reaching the levels that in the past we have only attempted to get a quarter to a third of our young people to reach. So this is daunting, but we need to find ways of communicating and acknowledging that educators and educational systems and those in them are charged with a new mission, this bringing of everyone to the higher level. So it's not a blame. It's, although there are many, many problems in education and many ways in which all of us have failed young people, primarily it's a different job. It's a different mission. And we need to be able to mobilize and talk about that in ways that are energizing rather than are paralyzing. We also need to recognize that for all of the difficult and painful data that we see of where Americans are compared to other countries, or how NAEP data is stuck at the 8th grade level or the 12th grade level, we also need to recognize that we are making some gains. We've made graduation has risen. High school graduation gains for the first time are now happening 3 years in a row. Gains at the achievement at the elementary level as measured by NAEP. And we need to communicate that there are powerful systemic strategies while simultaneously addressing poverty and other social policy fields. So it's not an either or. We need to find ways of talking about transformational change that is a value proposition that suggests that we need to be engaging in new redesigns in education that take account of poverty while still countering poverty through other social policy means. That is, education is not the only strategy for social mobility, but it is also one and a very central strategy for social mobility. So obviously, I'm suggesting that we need to foster some sense of, can-do attitude, which is not the same as a no excuses. It's a sense that we need to be at this and to have perseverance and energy. And we need to foster pragmatic discussion of what is possible in the space between our goals, our proof points of success, and our proof points of success without overstating or responding, either overstating, this is one thing that's going to transform public education, or on the other side, responding with pessimism and cynicism to every proposed reform. We need to acknowledge gains, understand how they come about, communicate strengths and assets that our young people are for our country when their energy and talents are unlocked, and broaden respect for teaching. So where are we now? So let me get to I only have a couple slides. Okay. So this is just to review for a minute the picture I was just saying about what this daunting challenge is. So on the left, and I've done this on STEM learning because it's something that I've been working on, and it fits with both college readiness, but I also think that STEM learning is one of the STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math, but it's one of the ways of making real what we talk about college readiness. So I'll explain. So the red is this picture of American students. The red is not fully prepared for college and career when you leave high school. So we have 25% of our students who still don't graduate from high school, and we have close to 40% who need some remediation, particularly in mathematics. Mathematics is the barrier course, not getting through first year mathematics. That's the red. The yellow are those who don't need remediation, graduate, don't need remediation, and get through a first year math course. The blue-green up there is a picture of who's ready to do advanced mathematics in college. Okay? So when people talk about where the United States needs to go, what is our challenge, and you hear a lot of talk about that in STEM, we need to be generating more people, but even if we just take it from the perspective of moving all of our students to being STEM capable, and I use this, and I'll just illustrate sometimes with going in the weeds, but to fundamentally say math skills, according to the Georgetown Center on Work and Education, math skills are the one factor that most closely tracks with earnings. Okay? And math skills at all levels. So that picture on the right is in a transformed system. You're not just trying to build the blue-green out, right, from the yellow. Essentially what we're saying here is we have to move everybody. We have to be, if we're going to move the top, we have to move everyone. Okay, so where are we now? How steep is the climb? The climb's pretty steep, right? So that's why we talk about transformation rather than something a little less daunting. So now that we've just looked at the current status, I want to talk an articulation of a way of thinking about a pathway to success and pathway weaknesses and possible things to do. So one way of thinking about transformation is, when you're thinking systemically, is I guess I should stay over here, what are levers of change? Where can we intervene? Are there any high impact places to intervene? So the first one, so the picture here is trying to depict whether we can get a pathway to success. Okay? So on the left, it's narrow pathways of success. And students who are through them, and you know many of them and among your friends and colleagues, have had the opportunity to have strong teaching and in schools where there were good principals, where people knew their subject, where they had instructional practices, and where you had a lot of capability. Where there was high standards, demanding curriculum, and assessments that told you where you were going in a real way, and where the school and system design was linked, where what happened in K-12 was linked to where you're going, studying the right material, meeting the standards that were needed, learning progressions that built one to the other, plus the whole socio-emotional identity formation of being able to move in these ways. So in our system right now, we have weaknesses in each of those ovals, but also they're misaligned. So you might get one, and when we talk about Common Core State Standards, which I'm going to talk about as important in a minute as the one piece of this, if the standards are the only thing you have, and you're not working on organizing to have strong and capable teaching, instruction from the standards, or we're not organizing school in a way to use time, technology, relationships, other things, then we're not going to have the pathway work, okay? The other side is, of course, if it all comes together and is strong, we have this nice broad pathway for everybody to move. Okay, I'm going to hold this one for a minute and just speak. So going back to this second slide here, let's consider the levers of change. A really critical point in transformational change is where you're going. Transforming toward what, right? And we were talking before about whether people agree on what that what is, but we've had agreement in this country for the first time by 45 states and the District of Columbia on a set of English language arts and mathematics standards, K-12, that are the first large-scale, meaningful common expectations for the performance of students, teachers, and schools. The standards movement has gone on for more than 20 years, but the notion of the states coming together and actually putting forth these kinds of policy decisions really are focusing the country, focusing the states in the country on taking up the challenge of implementing far more rigorous academic learning. Common Core standards are the architecture for deeper learning. To guide students toward mastering a high level of cognitive and social learning. What is the context for Common Core standards when thinking about this transformational change I was talking about needing from what someone has called my wedding cake slide that you just saw there? Well, 20 years ago, no state in the South required Algebra 1 for high school graduation. The state of New York State didn't require Algebra 1. Many states didn't require algebra for high school graduation. Pennsylvania let local entities, local governmental entities, set their own graduation requirements. The high school exit exam in California was pegged at 8th grade. Okay. 12 years ago, in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity case in New York State, the state argued that a sound basic education was equivalent to 8th grade. Right? This is an enormous change and a long overdue change. And setting a North Star or a pole star is one way of thinking about Common Core state standards. Also addresses mobility within the country, or a range of issues like that. But another way of thinking about it, which is a little more granular, is that we know a lot more than we used to know, thank goodness, from research and the work of many cognitive scientists as well as other education researchers. We know a lot more about learning progressions and how it is. So if we are working on this challenge of how you accelerate the learning or how you bring everyone to this, right, Common Core standards can help suggest a pathway. And just to illustrate that, for example, if we're trying to bring everyone to algebra, or algebra 2, as I was just talking about there, a really critical learning progression is fractions ratios, right? So how do schools know how much time to spend on that, or that mastery of that is absolutely critical if we're going to, so it's working backwards, et cetera. And then also, what is required? How do we get students more prepared for college? So it's both kinds of things. So it's both a North Star, and it's making explicit a kind of pathway. The second oval there, strengthening teacher capacity. Engage, prepare, recruit, support, assess professional career ladders. The entire world of teaching is changing. The profession is changing, the job is changing. There are many, many different kinds of demands. At the same time, for transformation to happen in an education system, we actually have to fundamentally recognize that it's a people business. It's a business that requires, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later, relationship. Right? How does anybody learn? Right? You learn by what you do, what you're exposed to, what you do, who you do it with, and how you make meaning. Right? So no matter how much technology, and when we talk about the importance of technology as the promise of technology, we still have the actual human interaction and the intellectual life that has to happen in the formation of academic identity as well. And so teaching is a critical lever of change in transformational change. It's one that's very difficult right now. Some policy directions that attempt to solve one problem in teaching, that is where we've had deployment of the newest and lowest performing teachers to the poorest schools. We'll have tried to address that, sometimes with blunt instruments, and that have had the other effect of not having as much respect for teaching. So you get a very complex dynamic going on here. But I would say that one of the points I want to make about transformational change here is that teaching has to be situated in this third area, which is the third area of school and system design. So essentially, key to the transformational change, that's what I'm arguing, is that we must organize around school and system design. We need to, goal is to have systems of effective schools that have a mission and purpose that includes strengthening democracy and preparing all students for college and career readiness. But we can't reach these standards, the Common Core standards, without reshaping public education to make its primary focus the development and support of individually effective schools and learning environments, broaden the definition of school. Our schools must create environments that draw in talented educators, enable them with the best professional and technical knowledge, skills, and instructional tools, continuously improve through R&D, and provide students with academic and developmental supports and opportunities that foster motivation, engagement, persistence, achievement, and draw on assets and communities. Developing schools that bring all students to this high level of learning is a challenge that requires coherence in design rather than fragmentation of strategies or interventions. And that's my inadequate slide that I made myself without help from anyone. That's why you can see that it's not as well done here as everyone's, but I'm going to try to speak to it anyway. What I'm trying to say here is that when we try to approach transformational school design in only one quadrant or only focus on one area, we can't do it. That, in fact, system design is really, really critical. And I tried to put them in different ways of thinking about what these are. So on the left, on the top there, is mission, purpose, goals, expectations. Where are we going? What is this big picture, Common Core state standards, small or micro picture? What is this school about? What are we doing? If we don't have a sense of meaning, how can kids have a sense of meaning, right? There has to be something that we're trying to do that is understood and affiliated in every school. How do we get that to happen, right? On the right-hand top is the human dimensions. As I said, this is a human enterprise. Talent capacity, but relationships. What can we do in school design to foster positive, productive relationships between young people who are known well and who have relationships with also a primary person, but also key people who can help shape their identities. When we're talking about adolescence and accelerating the the learning of adolescence, I think a really key point of that is to think about what's the job of adolescence. What do you have to do when you're an adolescent? You have to build competencies and you have to form an identity, right? It's not a fully formed identity, but it's a pretty much formed identity, right? And it's malleable, and if it's going to be formed in a way that supports academic growth, right? It has to include a sense of agency around academic life that happens through relationships and through experiences and opportunities. Obviously, that's about school culture. How do the adults have opportunities to work together, to build trust, to persevere, to understand the students, whether that's on socio-emotional levels or on academic levels, using data? How do we redefine, how do we create schools that can do that? On the bottom left, it's really the professional technical core. What do we know about about getting great curriculum, great curricular experiences, instructional practices, personalized learning? How do we use different supports to assess and tools to assess where students are, how they can accelerate, use time differently, expand the kinds of adults who are present in a school? That actually should be on relationships, partnerships that expand out the experiences for forming identity, whether those are career partnerships or other kinds of experiences. And then also this whole notion of research and development. How do we form that kind of continuous improvement so that the research that's happening in universities is actually usable? I mean, the example I gave before around math and ratios is one that comes out of some work I've been doing at the National Science Foundation and with others on a STEM learning committee around the notion of what if really core number of researchers focused in a coordinated way on that problem of teaching and learning ratios? It's a high impact problem. If we could get that solved, that could go a long way to accelerating learning, right? Okay, and obviously data systems, technology, and fundamentally capacities like change management. And then on the right-hand side, both in the top and the bottom with governance, there's this whole issue of participation, schooling as a democratic institution. How do we have governance that enables system change rather than thwarting system change? And that engages participation, because we can't actually do this without voters voting for tax levy, without others who actually see a value proposition in investing in education, in building public will. So I think the most important thing I want to say about, to me, the most important thing I want to say about this is this notion that it's a dynamic model, right? If I were better at this and had more time, I was trying to put arrows in and to the things that would say to you that this is a dynamic model. The last slide you can't read, but I'm going to tell you how you can get it if you're interested in it. But I'll just say a few words about it, as I'm going to talk about two illustrations. So I want to talk about transformational change by talking about the experience of secondary reform, high school reform in New York City that Paul was introducing. He said that I did. So during my time in New York City, and why I actually went to New York City at the invitation to start on the very beginning of the reform when Joel Klein became the chancellor, is that I was working, as I said, on high school reform. And had the opportunity to propose that we could, based on something we were doing with a nonprofit education organization, New Visions, that we needed to take the lowest performing high schools in New York City, whose graduation rates ranged from 22% to 42%, and end that part of the system. That we'd had incremental change pushed on that, but that they were schools that at that moment in time were serving a function in this that was detrimental to young people, and that they were too dysfunctional. We needed a more powerful model, and we needed to start with the design characteristics of effective schools. And we began a process of phase out as I went into the department, and a very different way of creating, and we created 200 new small schools over the course of 5 years. Each one of these schools was created through a design competition in which this nonprofit organization, in partnership with the department, ran a design competition for principals, teachers, community partners, parents, to come together and propose schools. And actually, we wound up funding and approving only about half of those that were done. But there was an entire mobilization of the city around a set of design principles based on research that would go through a rigorous planning process that demonstrated the capacity to put in place strong and capable school leaders, high quality teaching across disciplines, accountability for all students, academically strong curriculum leading to a Regents diploma, parent and community engagement, student voice, to name some. This entire high school reform, which is now called Small Schools of Choice from the research and evaluation that's been done by MDRC, has turned out to have had very successful outcomes for very large numbers of students. The MDRC research did not compare with the 22 and to 42% graduation rate schools, but rather because in the system we were also redesigning high school admissions. So there are naturally occurring lotteries. These were all schools of choice, small schools of choice. So these are, there was an ability to do a random assignment study. The small schools of choice, and the study involves 21,000 students. It's all of the schools that at the point the study started had graduation, had students that would be on their pathway to graduation. There are now even more schools, there's over 300. 10 percentage points graduation gains. The students in these schools are now, there's been a follow-up study as there's more and more kids getting through the cohort. The gains have been sustained. They're at 70% graduation with, at the same time of implementing higher standards, the region standards. Remember I told you before that not only do we have a 50% graduation rate as a city, but no one was required, you weren't required to get to pass Regents exams, which are statewide 5-subject exams. So it's transformational change at scale, involves the same number of students as all of the high school students in the city of Houston, right, which is the 4th largest district in the US, because New York is so big. So these students were overwhelmingly students of color. They're overwhelmingly low-income, free, reduced in lunch. They made dramatic, accelerated change by being in schools that had the design characteristics of effective schools that were then supported by a district enabling these. What do I mean by a district enabling these? Well, first let me say just a few more words on the design characteristics. So I said a mission, purpose, high-quality curriculum, instructional leadership where teachers can come together, high-quality professionalism, ability to choose principals and teachers to affiliate, which we had to negotiate with the union and change the contract, and the union agreed to changing the contract on this. This was, as I said before, transformational change can be daunting, but it can be successful. Porous schools, schools that had boundaries. So if you were a kid in the school, the community-based organization that was working there is just a part of your school. The mission, it's not an add-on. And you might be going to school from 8 until 4 or 8 until 5, because that is how your experience is of what school is. Some of them were career-oriented. Some of, by career, that does not mean not college, but they had some theme that was also career-oriented. So a blending, and this is the beginning, but we do have a range of success. So what did they do besides what I said about innovating around using research-based design principles? Redefine partnerships, define success in terms of student outcomes, set the bar. We actually set the goal of 80% graduation rates. So they've gotten from 50 to 70, and they've gotten it for every group. For every group has gone up, every demographic group. And change the district. Targeting improvement school leadership, teacher recruitment, deploying resources, finances differently, student admissions, school-based budgeting, and at the district level, cross-functional planning with timetables for delivering on promises. This is one of the things we have to do is change the district. So let me just go to one more example of transformational change that I think is broader geographically than New York City. And that is in STEM learning, what's going on in the country in STEM teaching and learning. So I think it's illustrative of broader possibilities for assets for transformational learning. At Carnegie Corporation, we have emphasized the importance of STEM learning through report The Opportunity Equation, Transforming Mathematics and Science Education in the United States. And we called for changes in all those 3 levers of change that I was talking about. The standards, it came out right before Common Core State Standards. We've been supporting next generation science standards, and teaching and doing school differently. What we're seeing across the country is a kind of movement that's using STEM to look at those same kind of design principles in schools, and also to think about innovation and movement building around teaching. And I say teaching rather than merely teachers. Although projections are we need 100,000 new STEM teachers over the next 10 years, actually starting 2 years ago when the president announced it. And we are part of a partnership called 100K in 10 that you can learn about. We've also sponsored an Ashoka Changemakers Challenge, in which we just put out through Ashoka asking for, around the country, what are examples of new kinds of partnerships to redesign school for STEM learning. Ashoka thought in a typical competition they have like this, good results would be 75 entrants, but 256 from every part of the country, involving after-school programs, industry, government partnerships in the aerospace industry, in the biotech industry. People are redefining school with many, many more nonprofit organizations that are engaged as intermediaries, engaged in school development, in school design, and in rethinking both the school day and what actually kids experience as school. This is very promising for building the possibilities of implementing Common Core State Standards and next generation science standards. On 100K in 10, within 2 years, 150 organizations have pledged, made commitments, deep commitments, in recruiting, supporting, retaining excellence, or building the movement for STEM teaching. And they haven't just signed on. They've actually said, we will recruit this many students in this way. And it will be a vertical alignment between our university, for example, in Maryland, and the state of Maryland's STEM policy and the teacher residency. So there's really a lot of seeding of innovation and creating of supply right now that are the basic elements that we could have for transformative change in education if we move and see this as a dynamic model. So I think that what I would want to leave you with and have some dialogue about is that it's an incredibly critical time right now. It's a difficult time in our country. Our democratic institutions are not matching up to, they're not showing the capability of addressing the kind of key societal challenges that we have. But there's also a tremendous amount of positive activity that has resulted in proof points. So we no longer can say, we should no longer doubt that adolescents who are coming from low-income environments can learn at high levels. We need to figure out how we can make the public investment that is smart, that is designed, that is coordinated and dynamic, so that we build on all the assets in our community to foster this kind of transformative change. Thank you. So any comments, questions? Yes?
Microphones in the aisle, and this is being taped, so if you use those microphones, it would help.
I am interested in how you define STEM learning. The reason, let me kind of give you some context to that. I worked with the American Society of Engineering Educators, their corporate member council, and we were trying to come up with a rubric that engineers in the industry could kind of partner with schools. The engineers said, we don't know what to do when we get to a school. And so we were trying to come up with, what is STEM learning? And it was amazing. 20 different engineers from 20 different industries could not pinpoint what it was. So we went out as a corporate member council and started asking educators. We were a part of the American Society of Engineering Educators, so that's a good place to start, right? So it was interesting to see people define it as, well, it's any time you have any of those four silos, science, technology, engineering. So if you have a school that really emphasizes those, then you're a STEM school. Where others would say the other end of the spectrum was, no, it's when you blend those things together. And so I'm on that side of the fence, personally. Probably comes from an NYU professor of physics that I met one time that said he liked me until he heard I was a math teacher, and said we never should have split math and science training. That's the essence of STEM. So I'm interested in what you define STEM learning as.
Sure, thanks. That's a great, it's not only a great question, it's a question that has absorbed people from 26 states and the National Academies of Science over the last 2 years in the formation of the next generation science standards. And you can actually get lots of information at it at nextgenscience.org. But the National Academy of Sciences, Carnegie funded them to take up the question of what is a framework for STEM learning. And the framework then guided the development of those standards. And the framework looks at content, content, skills, and concepts and practices, and the interplay of these. And it is the first time that engineering practices, including design, have been interwoven in this. So I don't want to say that it's just a blend, because there are, but I think that the notion of STEM learning includes complex skills, learned through content, right? One of the challenges that it's really both a challenge and a fascination, is that more than half of what we know in science has been discovered in the last 50 years, and that 50 is rapidly changing. We're going to know more than half. And so many sciences are changing. Look at that, how mathematical biology is now, or how computer science, chemistry is. So there's a whole range of changes, but I would refer you to that and to the Next Gen Science standards, and Achieve, the organization it's the Achieve website also leans to it. Achieve worked with the 26 states. Okay, sir?
Jed Schwartz, I just wanted to indicate my vaguely uneasy reaction to your remarks, because it sounds like the future, the object of this transformation is more education for jobs, less education for liberal arts. I mean, if some of the people in this room probably are going to be history or English teachers, and they seem to be left by the wayside.
Well, let me, and I'll be happy to answer that.
Let me just
Sure.
go on for just a little bit, because so I would say that what's needed is, I mean, I'm all for STEM, the concentration and the improvement of those 4 areas, but I'm also for an equal emphasis on English, history, and literature in general, art, things like that, because the question is, what STEM education for what? And that question, you can't give math for what, engineering for what? You really need to get into history and literature. And the problem with the teaching of those subjects in the United States, it seems to me, if I can risk being pretentious, is that we've all been traumatized by a senator from Wisconsin who went wild in 1953, whose name is Joseph McCarthy, and and so that we're very much afraid to ask the questions of our high school to ask our high school teachers to teach history from the point of view of political relevance, or even literature from the point of view of political relevance, and if we don't do that, we're likely to see the society. If we don't begin to teach that, I think we're likely to see our society turned over to a sort of pseudo-technological corporate elite, which is the trend that I think a lot of people have noticed. Thank you.
Sure. So Common Core state standards are, in English language arts, are critically important and very deep, and include literacy across the curriculum, particularly in social studies and science. So it is not, this is in no way to suggest you don't need a broad education. And in the high school reform that I was referencing before I gave the STEM field examples, the high school reform includes five regions, one of which is American history, English, mathematics, living environment, and I can't believe I can't do the 5 regions, global studies. So it's a broad, much broader education than high school students were receiving before. Some of the intermediary organizations are also arts and culture organizations and organizations like Facing History. I think it's really critical. I think there's a difficulty, and I would just take issue with one thing you're saying. I'm not suggesting that education is only for jobs. That's why I was talking about democracy. But I think that social mobility is really critically important in our society, and that you can't have a functioning democracy without opportunity for social mobility. And with the change in jobs, students do need these higher levels of academic learning across the spectrum, but including mathematics, which they're not getting now.
One of the most rapidly transforming fields in education right now, I think, is research. Like, there's been a lot of research coming out recently that applies kind of methods of more like hard sciences to social science research and education, but it seems like there are large divides right now between what's happening in research and what's going on in policy, and then even more divides between kind of common knowledge in research versus common knowledge among practitioners. And I'm wondering whether you have any experience with or ideas about how to kind of bridge the gaps between like researchers, policymakers, and practitioners.
Can you just say the common knowledge? Say a little more what you mean there.
So when you talk to teachers, at least in my experience, you hear a lot about decreasing class sizes, intervening with parents. Like if the parents aren't involved, you can't improve what's going on in the classroom. If you talk to researchers, you hear a lot more about depending on schools and teachers, increasing instructional time. Things
I
like
understand.
that.
Yeah, thank you. So I think there is the lived experience in schools that in thinking about those design characteristics in which many people don't have the kinds of supports. Many teachers don't have the kinds of supports that are in that ideal version of design characteristics. And so they are, and you know, I know this from experience as well, focused on practical kinds of research. Like, what do we know about effective ways of engaging parents or of getting students to be able to persist longer in it? I think there's a bit of a movement to have improvement science risk kinds of research to focus on real problems of practice in short time frames. It's something New Visions has done, the 90-day process, in which teachers in a school identify a problem of practice and get researchers working with them on this to see what is known in the world about this, what can they know from some research going on in the school. That, you know, that's a form of research. It's not the same as a random assignment study that I was talking about something big, but, I mean, some macro. I didn't mean big as in important, but macro. I think that we need to think about teachers as researchers, as part of a research endeavor. And then we also need to think about translational research. Like, how do we actually not just have studies and then try to translate them, but be thinking about that in the same way from the beginning. I think the Carnegie Foundation, not us, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching in California has a number of really interesting papers about research and teachers. You might want to look at. Hi.
Hi. Excuse me. I'm intrigued by a remark you made in passing comparing can-do schools as being different from no excuses schools. And no excuses seems something these days like a shibboleth that conservative organizations who have a very paternalistic approach to education and do in fact have limited, not unlimited upside expectations of their students are using to get their way in public policy debates. And speaking against no excuses schools is a little bit like trying to answer that question, have you stopped beating your wife? Could you say a little bit more about the contrast you hinted at between, in your mind, a can-do school and a no excuses school?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that you're pointing to something I think is very important when I was talking about pragmatic or dialogue that's pragmatic, right? The no excuses, you know, movement, or I don't know if it's a movement, the no excuses approach and language, I think got generated, at least in the original way I experienced it, out of a sense of trying to push for high expectations and counter low expectations, right? Paul mentioned that I worked with setting up beacon schools. They were in 80 neighborhoods in New York City, after school and school-based community centers. And in the first 10 that we started, we got to those schools by identifying neighborhoods with the highest child poverty, highest foster care placement, and highest juvenile arrest. This is in 1991. I went out to every one of those schools, and I could not believe what I was seeing, even though I had worked with schools my whole life, or been in schools, and I was a public school parent. They were awful, so far below adequate, with so low expectations. Special ed kids on the whole top floor that, you go up there, there's no teachers. I mean, this was just, and I've seen this in other places. So I think that the giving up on high school students, going to a school and in the middle of October, a high school, and finding out there were 19 vacancies, 19 teacher vacancies. I mean, fundamentally, could we give kids teachers, right? So that kind of low expectation, I think, generated this, fight back. Like, no excuses. There can be, poverty's not an excuse. We can do this. Look what this school can do. What I mean by, and then that generates the response back, that, doesn't matter how poor kids are. Poverty doesn't matter. Poverty matters. It matters how much you have to struggle. It isn't just poverty. Kids are living in high-risk environments in all kinds of ways. I worked with schools where I was doing beacons where a third of the kids were in foster care placement, right? That's a harder school. It needs, the adults in that school need something else. The can-do is, how do we marshal the resources and do a design? So when we were creating those new high schools, we couldn't create them without community-based partnerships. I opened 23 schools, newly designed schools for kids who were already dropped out or were 2 years over age, undercredited, and had attendance of between 20 and 50%. It would have been crazy to open those schools without having a design that was bringing in the expertise, right? On the expertise of community-based organizations, so youth development organizations, and a design model of internships and other things to work on everything. That would be, to me, a can-do kind of model. It's using, using our intelligence to figure out what do you need in particular situations to make this work. On the other hand, when we were first doing those, some of the organizations that wanted to apply to do them did not want to be held accountable in what I think of as reciprocal accountability, so I was in the government then, for money for high school graduation. We had to have, it wasn't good enough that kids felt better about themselves, or they even improved their attendance. They were 17 to 19 years old. It's the end of the line. Graduation's got to be the outcome. So it's that kind of movement. Paul, sorry. Oh, excuse me. I think
Michele, I want to rewind to the beginning of your talk, and you made the case that we're asking schools to do a new job, and we're asking them to educate everybody to a high level and have high expectations. And you've implied at least a differential approach to how we get there, talking about poverty matters and things of that nature. So you make the case for transformative change, and the first thing you said, the first point was that we needed to build optimism, a sense of possibility, and a sense of urgency that this not only can be done, but should be done. Mm-hmm. We're in a time where we have difficult time building a sense of optimism and urgency that we should provide quality health care to everybody. We're in a time where we're just struggling out of a recession, and it's likely that this kind of transformative change is a broader piece of education work than we've invested in the past, and therefore it's going to cost more. I wonder how optimistic you are about generating that sense of urgency and what you think it's important to do in order to generate that sense of urgency so that we get an investment in the kind of transformative change that you're talking about as necessary.
Yeah. Let me say what I think is needed first, and then I'll judge how optimistic I am.
Right.
we need this pragmatic dialogue like we were just having here so that we don't waste a lot of time and energy on, is it poverty, is it no excuses, right? We have to use that energy to create new ideas, bring out ideas about, as I was suggesting, that came out of that idea contest around STEM and after school and other kinds of teaching. We need proof points. And I think I was thinking about this a lot before this talk and coming to Harvard and talking about it. That's why I talked about the pragmatic dialogue, because you're important for the voices, right? You have an important voice. I think we spend a lot of time critiquing progress, right? Because it isn't yet where we need it to be, right? So that if we adopt Common Core standards and test scores go down, whether or not you agree with the test scores, right? It's throw up our hands, we're getting nowhere, right? Rather than this is where we have to be, what's a reasonable target? And who can speak to that? Who can speak to that and speak to the dynamic of what needs to happen to make it better? That's why I was also talking about high impact or levers of change. If we could get dialogue about what are some key things to be talking about. Proof points, I think all of that is important, and allies. Sometimes I think that, there are real contested areas. Some people on the right think that choice is going to solve it with very little money, right? Sometimes on the left, we can't do very much until we solve poverty, right? And so I think that to generate a sense of energy, there has to be more of dialogue about what's the terrain that we can shorten the gap between where we're trying to get to, right? And some pragmatic strategies for getting there. And that's what makes me, I feel optimistic, but I feel optimistic because I can really see that we do have examples of getting change at scale. They're very hard, they're very politically contentious, but it's possible.
I understand what you're getting, and I do think that it has to move beyond our dialogue within our own reform community to the kind of national dialogue at that level of being urgent, as you put it, for our economy, for our democracy, and framing it in ways that may be different than we'd frame it in a forum like this in order to sort of catch that attention.
I think you're
and
100%
urgency.
right. It's interesting because, and speaking back to this gentleman, I don't come out of STEM. I often feel like an imposter in that world. But it is something that is understandable and is getting a broader response. Some problems with that, but there are also ways in which it is also energizing to a range of people who are outside of the dialogue around education reform.
That's true.
Okay,
Thank you.
sir.
You spoke about, or you showed us the numbers about how many people are unprepared to tackle STEM areas. But what about the other chunk of people that, even if they are prepared, are kind of running away from those subjects? And the numbers show, how for every one person in STEM major, there's 19 people in drama and 45 people in all the other subjects. So when you talk about this transformation, is tackling that kind of question of engagement in these areas and interest in these areas, is that part of the problem? Is it the same problem? Is it as big of a problem? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's an interesting, when I say good, I guess that means stuff I'm interested in. Anthony Carnevale, the economist who directs the Center for Education in the Workforce, showed some very interesting data about this question of whether we have enough people prepared for the STEM jobs, right? Coming into college, we still have enough people with math. The thing is, so many other jobs are requiring math, and so many other jobs are of interest to people who have those skills, whether because they make more money or because they just have an interest in it, like film or digital kinds of work, which is now very interestingly in computers and mathematics. So there's a broader change in the society in terms of the kinds of skills that are needed across a wide range. But I do think there's the question of inspiration, and that STEM needs its own kind of reform. I'm actually funding a group of leading mathematicians around the country. There's been a new report from the National Academy of Sciences called Math 2025, which is about real redesign in the teaching of undergraduate and graduate mathematics. And people are thinking about this in the other STEM subjects as well, and also careers, because it's been divorced in some ways from the broader big picture problems in society that people might work on. And so I think there is this question of inspiration. And the maker movement is very interesting about this. In a range of science and science research institutes and museums, they're doing things with young kids as well as teenagers and college students on maker, using science to make things and develop creativity across art, across a whole range of other ways. Mm-hmm. In terms of underrepresented students in science and math and STEM areas, let me just say a word about that. That's something that NSF is working on very much, and this notion of broad purpose and engagement. But also, we funded something called STEM Posse, which is actually turning out to be quite successful. And it's one of the first program is at Brandeis here, and it's a notion of peer support for going through STEM majors. Okay, go ahead, sir, ma'am.
Hi.
Hi.
I wonder if part of the solution is also is in looking at just great teachers. Mm-hmm. So I wonder, looking at your design competition, I was thinking of, for example, take algebra, history, or whatever. Pick the subject, but pick, have students nominate the best teachers all over the country, mm-hmm. get them all together in a conference, and there's got to be something, no matter what, something underlying that's common in their approach to teaching, mm-hmm. That includes above concepts and subject matter, got to do with imagination and empathy and the ability to sort of dwell in the minds of the 8th grader. And so I wonder if we turn to the great teachers for solutions, for part of the solutions. Do you know if such experiments have been done?
I think they've been done in particular places, but there's one that's going on right now that you might be interested in, having to do with that 100K in 10, and it's www.100K in 10, the numerals, .org. This is partnership, as I said, of 150 organizations. And these organizations have come together to identify, through their own participants, members, what is working, and to identify high priority areas that they want to work on together. And right now they're doing these things of shared measures and an annual survey, but to look at questions like that and to figure out some effective ways in which you could mobilize the knowledge of teachers. So I think I'd be happy to talk to you more about that.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Hi.
Hi, my question is about strategy in education reform. I was struck when you were giving the example of teaching math ratios, right? What's the best way to teach math ratios? And it seems like someone out there must know that. So my question is, at what point should we be shifting resources from innovating and researching these brilliant ideas to developing them and bringing them to scale and implementing them? And You know, it seems like there are so many innovations happening in education, but schools don't have the time to catch up, right? So I'm not anti-research, but
No, I get it.
But how do they, you
Yeah.
know, how do we make sure that we're sort of developing systems as we go?
So let me take the example, first of all. We do know how to teach ratios. We just don't know how to teach it effectively to everybody. And it's actually a really big problem. Uri Treisman at the University of Texas, Austin, who's working with districts and schools around the country, talked about how algebra for all is turning into algebra forever, right? And that students are going through, you know, it twice and 3 times. At Johns Hopkins, Bob Balfans has done this major study of different kinds of treatments for getting students through algebra, you know, double periods or accelerated learning, et cetera. The point is that I was trying to make with that is it's really very specific to like learning progressions. If we actually know that there's something that we don't know how to do well, right, for all students, let's try to focus rather than having 25 different kinds of interesting topics that people are interested in but are not high impact, and try to get to a solution. But the second point, I think, is what I was trying to get to with this dynamic process of looking at this change. Doing something like creating 200 new small schools through a design competition brings together research with practice, application, and real people having to do it, and then you can study that. But you've got to start doing it, absolutely. Yes?
Hi, Michele. It's Karen Mapp.
Oh, yeah. Hi,
How
Karen.
are
I
you?
can't see.
Question for you. We are in the process here at the Graduate School of Education, since we have a new dean, of doing some self-reflection on who we should be, how we should organize ourselves, how we should do the work. So given the sense of urgency that you feel we need to create, what do you feel graduate schools of education should be doing to aid and abet this transformational change? I might ask it another way. If you were starting your own graduate school of education right now, what would it look like in order to support this kind of work?
Karen, I have a lot of thoughts on this. I'm trying to organize them in some way. And also, I'm just glad to see you and all your wonderful work over the years. So I think first I would say, what is the purpose of our graduate school of education? And what's its enduring purpose? And what's its potentially high-impact niche now, given where we are in this world, right, in our country? And I would look at that, or some better version of that design, putting design at the center, and see where a graduate school could have an impact, a contribution in maybe better together. So first of all, getting out the idea of what transformation is, that it all has to work together. And then secondly, if there's a decision that primary mission is producing leaders and teachers, right? What do we know about the best way of doing that in terms of content, knowledge, complex skills, and practice, and having a positive feedback loop to research? So I guess that's kind of where I would start, and maybe with some I don't know what the right word is. It's like some choices about what are the most high impact things you'd want to be working on. Maybe this issue of adolescents and who are in poverty and what kind of schools are working most directly, or some other thing like that. Okay, yes?
Hi, thank you for coming to speak tonight. So
Thank you.
I think one of the intriguing points of your discussion was that how STEM's become a message that it's allowed us to think about innovation and movement building around instruction in order to support the skills and knowledge students need to kind of get STEM jobs. I'm curious about the other end in terms of literacy. You know, you had mentioned earlier in your speech that we've seen gains in elementary but not in secondary, and I'm somewhat skeptical that it's a result of large reading gaps within students, especially at the middle school level.
Yeah.
So what's being done on a literacy movement in terms of resources and investment being coordinated to support those needs for students?
Yeah. So Common Core State Standards in literacy are really different and really designed or targeted to address those gaps. One of the things that, I mean, it's a you know, it's a kind of saying, but I'll just say it is like, in the early grades, you're learning to read, then you're reading to learn, right? So when you see test scores across elementary and middle school, if you're a district administrator, district leader, what you see is if you make the same progress year to year, you automatically are going down because you have to make more progress in 5th, 6th, 7th grade, 8th grade. More rapid progress because you're having to read to learn much more and to take in much more general knowledge. Common Core State Standards in ELA are addressing that with, or they're setting it out as a guide. I think some of the most interesting innovations around literacy are the Gates Foundation is doing Literacy by Design, which is producing quite a lot of assignments, which are interesting. They're calling it something else. I've just forgotten the word. But it's essentially getting higher level work that students will be, teacher asking students to do, and for teachers to think. Second is reading apprenticeship out of West Ed in California, which I think is really fascinating in terms of comprehension and fluency and the sense of youth development and agency, which is particularly important for kids coming out of poor and low-income families. And I think they're getting some very interesting and good results. I think the difference, the point I was making about STEM is literacy is, everybody's for it. I mean, you don't really get opposition. So being it is more fun. But it is more a professional, technical kind of area right now than an area where others feel like they're bringing something to it, like you get with STEM. Okay, that's it. Well, thank you so much. This was a great conversation.
Michele, for joining us and giving us a lot to think about. Thank you, members of the audience, for your good questions and conversation. Please keep an eye out for the upcoming Askwith forums. We look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you for joining us this evening.